Thanks for choosing Grandma's Real Stories. Here, every episode uncovers a secret someone thought was buried until Grandma spoke from the grave. If you ever believed your grandma could forgive anything, you might want to take a second look at her will. I used to think it's just some old trinket, she won't even notice it's gone. But I was wrong. She knew, she always knew. And she stayed quiet until the final letter was opened on the day of her funeral. I was 22 when I stole the one thing my grandma never offered, but always gave: trust. I didn't just take an object, I took a piece of her that she never said out loud but wore every single day like breath. The locket was always there, not flashy, not new, just constant. Gold plated, maybe, but mostly faded. There was a tiny hinge and a soft click that used to echo in my memory like a lullaby. I'd play with it as a kid, sitting on her lap during old game shows. I remember asking her once what was inside. She smiled and said, "Soft things, the kind that bruises easy." I never asked again. And somehow, as I got older, I stopped touching it, like I knew I didn't deserve to anymore. By the time I turned 22, everything about my life felt like it was in past tense. College dropped, job gone, friends drifted. I was behind on rent, behind on hope, and ahead on excuses. So I came back home for the weekend like a coward comes crawling, pretending it was just to check in on her. But really, I had nowhere else to go. She welcomed me with soup, with slippers already set out. She made everything feel warm again, like I hadn't wrecked every room I'd ever been trusted in. And that night, when she went to bed early, I wandered into her room like I used to as a kid. But this time, I opened the drawer not to find her nail file or peppermint lotion. This time, I opened it for leverage. That locket sat right there, gently tangled in an old handkerchief. I held it for a long time. Told myself it was just temporary. I'd get some cash, buy groceries, maybe finally answer some of the bills stacking up like threats. Then I'd get it back. She wouldn't even know. I slipped it into my coat, didn't look back. Next morning, over toast and eggs, she asked if I slept okay. I said yeah. She smiled. She always smiled like that, tired but tender. Then, just before I left, she opened her dresser, just casual. Her fingers touched the empty cloth. She froze, turned, looked right at me. "Did you see my locket?" she asked, voice like a whisper trying not to be scared. And I lied. I lied so smoothly it scared me. "No, maybe it slipped behind something." She stared a second longer than comfort allowed. Then she nodded. Not like she believed me, more like she'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. She sat down quietly on the bed, pulled the blanket over her lap and whispered, "It always disappears when I stop checking." That line hit me later, not in the moment. Then I was still too full of ego. But the way she said it, like she wasn't talking about the locket. Like she was talking about people, about promises, about how much gets stolen when love doesn't lock its drawers. I told myself I'd fix it. Go back, buy it out, make things right, but I didn't. The pawn shop gave me 85 bucks. Enough for gas, some food, a week of pretending I hadn't just torn a hole through the last safe place I had left. 2 months passed. I visited her less. I couldn't face her eyes. Then came the hospital call. I showed up with flowers and shame stuffed deep in my pocket. She looked smaller in that bed, like life was slowly packing her up. She held my hand, looked at me hard, and said, "Take care of your soul." That was the last thing she ever said to me. After the funeral, I expected grief, maybe guilt, but I didn't expect a lawyer to call. Didn't expect a sealed envelope with my name written in her handwriting. Didn't expect the phrase, "You've been mentioned specifically in the will." And I sure as hell didn't expect what she wrote inside, because Grandma didn't raise her voice. She raised the consequences. The room was too quiet when the lawyer read her will. The kind of quiet where people forget to blink. My aunt shifted in her seat. My uncle cleared his throat like guilt was lodged there. I sat with my hands clasped so tight they were numb. I wasn't scared, I was prepared. I thought I'd get a small mention. A recipe book, maybe. An old photo. Something sentimental that said, "You hurt me, but I still love you." That's the kind of woman she was. But when he opened the envelope and read the first line, my stomach locked. To the grandchild who mistook silence for forgiveness, I knew. Heads turned, no name was said, but everyone in that room knew who it was meant for. The air turned thick, I kept still, tried to look confused, neutral, invisible. The lawyer kept going. I watched the drawer, I watched your hands, I listened for a confession that never came. You thought love meant I'd never speak. But some debts are settled after death. I thought I could swallow it, thought I'd braced for impact, but every word landed like a bruise I couldn't cover, and then the twist came. I went back to the pawn shop, I asked no questions. I paid what was asked, I held it one last time, then I rewrote my legacy. The lawyer reached into the folder and unfolded a new will. My name was missing, entirely. No sentimental heirlooms, no parting gifts, no middle ground mercy. But it didn't end there. She named Hannah instead. My cousin, the quiet one, the one who stayed behind during holidays, helped with dishes, walked grandma to church without ever needing to post about it. The one who never asked for anything, but noticed everything. To the soul who never touched the locket but honored it just the same, she wrote, I leave the heart I wore. Hannah's eyes welled. She didn't reach for it, didn't gloat. She looked at me like she didn't want to hold it either, like the weight of it scared her. The lawyer pulled out a small envelope next. My name on it, no title, no greeting, just one sheet, handwritten in blue ink. You were not erased, you were revealed. I kept your secret while you had time to break it yourself. You chose not to, so I let the silence teach you. My chest cracked open, not because I was angry, but because she was right. Every time I could have said something, I didn't. I told myself it didn't matter, that she was old, that she didn't know, but she did, she knew. And she didn't scream or shame, she waited, that's what killed me. She gave me the rope and I hung myself with it. I left the room before the end, couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were pressing in. I stumbled outside, sat on the curb like a child. I wanted to run. I wanted to go back in time. I wanted to scream at someone for not stopping me, but the only person I could scream at was already in the ground. And then Hannah came outside. Quiet, careful, holding the locket in her hand, she didn't say a word. Just sat next to me and waited. After a while, she said, I think she still believed in you. I think that's why she didn't say anything. She wanted to know if you would. I nodded, couldn't speak. The locket sparkled in the sunlight. A dull, aged gold, scratched, worn, still whole. She held it out. It's yours. I shook my head. I don't deserve it. She paused. That's not the point. It's not about deserve. It's about whether you see it now. And I did. Not just the object. The meaning, the lesson, the weight. I saw every moment I ignored. Every silence I filled with my own comfort. Every glance Grandma gave me where I looked away. The locket had never been the treasure. Her belief in me was. And I sold that for $85. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. The letter kept playing in my head like a broken hymn. Every word she wrote felt hotter than fire and colder than guilt. I kept hearing her voice, soft but surgical. You were not erased, you were revealed. I sat at the kitchen table in my empty apartment, the envelope lying next to a bowl of cereal I never touched. I stared at the handwriting like it might change if I looked long enough. Like the paper might forgive me if I just kept reading. But it didn't. The next morning, I got in my car and drove. No destination, just asphalt and noise. I didn't know where I was going until I ended up in front of the pawn shop. The same one. The sign buzzed like it was laughing at me. I walked in, same man behind the counter. I didn't even have to ask. He looked at me and said, "You're too late." An older woman picked it up, paid double. Said it was never for sale in the first place. That's when I broke, not with tears, but with something worse, understanding. She had gone back. She had walked into this place, probably clutching her coat tight, heart pounding, and paid to fix what I ruined. And she still never said a word to me about it. I asked the man if she left anything behind. He thought for a moment, then pulled out a folded receipt with 3 words scrawled on the back: "Check the drawer." I drove straight to her house. Still had the spare key. Everything was as she left it: plastic on the couch, the smell of lemon wood polish, and silence. Loud, old silence. In her bedroom, I opened the drawer, the same one. It looked empty. But in the back corner, behind a stack of tissues and a rubber band ball, was a small black notebook. I opened it. The first page said, "For the one who came back." My hands shook. I sat on the floor and read until my legs went numb. She wrote everything, every time I lied, every time I stayed silent, every time I chose myself over someone else. But she didn't write it with anger. She wrote it with ache. "I watched you become smaller," she wrote. "Not because you were weak, but because you believed you had nothing left to give. I never wanted you to be perfect. I just wanted you to stop running from the parts of yourself that needed love the most." And then I turned a page and stopped breathing, because it wasn't about me anymore. The next few entries weren't addressed to me. They were written to my mother. "You left before you knew how to stay. You hurt him before you learned what it meant to hold something and not squeeze it to death. But I forgave you, not for your sake, for his." For his, me, I flipped through more pages. Saw references to court dates, to emergency rooms, to things I was too young to remember. There were photos tucked inside. Me at age 2, me sleeping on her chest, me clutching the locket. And a small envelope marked, "Do not open until after the funeral." I opened it. Inside was a single photograph, one I had never seen. My mother holding me in the hospital, eyes swollen from crying. She looked terrified. And in the corner of the frame, Grandma's hand resting gently on her daughter's back. I stared at it for a long time, then I flipped it over. Written in blue ink, "She loved you, she just didn't know how to stay." I broke for real this time. Not dramatic, not loud, I just fell inward. All the noise left my body, and what was left was stillness. I had hated my mother for most of my life, for leaving, for never showing up, for making Grandma carry all of it. And now I realized, Grandma had been carrying me, yes, but also the weight of a daughter she never stopped hoping would come home. And maybe that's why she didn't confront me. Maybe that's why she wrote the letter after. Because she had lived through this before. And maybe she believed that shame doesn't heal people, but silence does. Not the kind that erases, the kind that mirrors, and that mirror had finally cracked in me. So I sat on that carpet, with her notebook in my lap, and said aloud, "I'm still here." Just 3 words, but they were mine. They were enough to start again. It's strange what grief sharpens. For some people, it's memory. For others, it's guilt. For me, it was hunger, not for food or comfort, for the truth. The kind that doesn't come clean, but crawls up from beneath everything you thought you understood. I stayed at Grandma's house that night, couldn't bring myself to leave. The notebook never left my hands. Every time I tried to set it down, something pulled me back. A line, a word, a weight. But it wasn't until I reached the back cover that I found it. A folded piece of newspaper taped flat inside, yellowed with time, torn along the edges like it had been hidden, moved, handled too much. The headline stopped me cold. "Local woman presses charges in domestic theft scandal. Husband walks." The article was short, dismissive, buried on page 9. But there, right in the middle, was her name, my grandmother S. Under it, a few lines about a minor altercation, family dispute, personal item exchanged for cash. I read it twice before it sank in. This wasn't the first time someone had taken something from her. This wasn't the first locket. My grandfather, my mother's father, had stolen from her too, pawned her wedding necklace, lied about it, walked out when she pressed charges. The paper painted her as bitter, said she overreacted, that it wasn't worth much. But she kept the article, taped it inside the notebook like a scar she refused to hide. And then came the twist I didn't see coming. Tucked in the back pocket of the journal was a key, small, brass, unlabeled. I knew what it was for. The little cedar chest at the foot of her bed. I had never been allowed to open it growing up. I carried it across the room like it might explode, sat on the floor, unlocked it. Inside, one faded baby blanket. A pair of ballet slippers no bigger than my palm. A broken cassette tape labeled Summer '94. And one envelope, thick, heavy, addressed to, "For him if he ever wants to know." I opened it with hands that didn't feel like mine. Inside were more letters, dozens, all written to me. None sent, some angry, some tender, some written in the middle of the night, some clearly unfinished. One said, "Today you told me I was too old to understand anything real." I smiled. But I died a little. Another, "You slammed the door so hard the locket fell off its hook." I picked it up, held it for a long time. Wondered how much of my daughter I see in you, and how much of me I hope survives. And then the one that broke me. "If you ever ask why I didn't confront you, here is the truth. I thought silence might succeed where punishment had already failed me." That sentence stayed with me for hours. I didn't move. Just sat there in the dark, with a box full of her pain and a letter full of my becoming. She had been trying to break a cycle. A quiet one. The kind no one writes about because it doesn't leave bruises, just absences. Her father stole from her. Her husband sold her heirlooms. Her daughter abandoned love. And her grandson became all three in one act. And still she didn't strike back. She documented. She archived the grief, the betrayal, the pattern. She didn't yell at me. She handed me evidence. She didn't bury the truth. She waited for me to be strong enough to exhume it, and when I finally did, it wasn't rage I felt. It wasn't even shame. It was legacy. Not the kind you inherit with property or rings, the kind that lives in the quiet choices, the kind that asks, "Will you be the one who ends this?" And sitting there in the dark, chest hollow, pages trembling, I whispered back, "I don't know. But I'm not walking away this time." I didn't pack anything, I just stayed. The house was too full of her to leave and too empty to survive. I started moving through it like I was underwater, slow, careful, afraid of disturbing whatever echoes she left behind. The kitchen still smelled like cinnamon and lemon oil. The hallway light still flickered like it always had, even though she swore she had it fixed. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in her bed. I stayed on the couch, under the same quilt she used to wrap me in as a kid when I fell asleep watching cartoons. That quilt didn't warm me, it just held me still. Every night I read more notebooks, more half-finished letters. Some were written in the margins of old church bulletins, others on the back of grocery lists. She had been writing her whole life, not journaling, not storytelling, just witnessing. She was documenting what no one else would say, what no one else stayed long enough to hold. On the fourth night, I found the small wooden box behind her sewing table. Inside, a faded Polaroid of my mom as a teenager, hair big and eyes hollow, a hospital bracelet, and a letter. No envelope, just folded, addressed to no one, meant for everyone. You do not break a curse with silence. You starve it until it forgets your name, and then you speak something different into your blood. I read that line 20 times because I had started to realize this wasn't just about her, or me, or even my mother. It was about a pattern, a script we'd all been handed. Hurt, hide, repeat. She had seen it coming in me. Felt it forming in the way I lied about the locket, not because I hated her, but because I was so used to disappearing, I didn't know how to stay. That night, I made a decision. I pulled out the old family Bible she kept in the hallway cabinet, not to pray, but because I remembered she used to press things inside it. And between the pages of Psalms and Proverbs, I found it, the original will. The one she never filed, the one with my name still on it. It was dated a year before the final one. Same handwriting, same signature, but this version, I got everything: the house, the jewelry, the locket, everything. She had changed it after the pawn shop. After the silence, she didn't remove me out of rage. She did it because she needed to leave a scar, one I couldn't ignore, one that wouldn't fade like apologies. I stared at that old version, hands shaking, and I knew I could take it. Burn the new one, call a lawyer, claim what once was mine. But I didn't. Instead, I folded it back, pressed it between the same pages she'd left it in, and closed the book. Because it wasn't about owning anything anymore. It was about choosing who I wanted to become. The next morning, I called Hannah. "Hey," I said, my voice cracked. She didn't say anything at first. Then, "I've been waiting for you to call." I told her everything about the old will, the journals, the letters, the box. And then I said, "I don't want anything back. I just want to make something good from it." She said, "Then come over." When I got to her apartment, she didn't hug me. She didn't cry. She handed me the locket. "I don't need it to remember her," she said, "but maybe you need it to remember you." So I held it in my palm. For the first time, it felt heavy, not because of guilt, but because it meant something again. Not just what I'd done wrong, but what I still had the power to do right. I didn't wear it. I didn't put it back on the chain. I put it in my pocket and walked home because I wasn't done carrying her, not yet. I used to think echoes were about sound, that they came from voices bouncing off hard things, walls, mountains, time. But what Grandma left behind wasn't noise, it was presence. A quiet weight that filled every room I stepped into. No matter how far I walked, she followed, not as a ghost, as a question, and I couldn't stop hearing it. Now that you know, what will you do? Grief is strange. It doesn't just arrive after the loss, sometimes it waits. Hides behind convenience, pretends to be numbness. And then one day, it shows up as a mirror. I started seeing her in everything: the shape of my handwriting, the way I folded my shirts, the way I spoke softer when people raised their voice. I had absorbed her and didn't even realize it. I used to think I was nothing like her. But now, I saw it all. Her silence was my armor, her patience was my punishment. And her love, the kind that never announced itself, was the exact kind I never knew how to return. I began walking around the neighborhood again, past the church where she lit candles for people she never told me about, past the bakery where she always bought day-old rolls because fresh bread didn't need her the way the old ones did. I saw the world through her rhythm, and it slowed me down in ways I didn't know I needed. One morning, I found the courage to visit the storage unit, the one she had rented for decades. I got the key from Hannah, who told me she had never gone, said she didn't want to disturb whatever Grandma had chosen to bury. I opened it alone. The light flickered, dust swirled, and in the middle sat a single rocking chair, a crate of books, and a tape recorder, labeled "If They Ever Ask." I sat on the floor and played it. Her voice crackled into the air. "If you're hearing this, then maybe you're brave enough to hold it. The truth. The weight. I never wanted to be a mystery. I just wanted to be safe." I stayed quiet because it was the only language this family listened to. But silence didn't save us. It just made the pain quieter for the neighbors. Her voice shook, then steadied. I forgave before I understood how. I survived before I healed. And I raised you hoping you'd be the one to do it differently. I closed my eyes, let her words wash through me like a storm that didn't want to destroy, just to wake the sleeping things inside me. When the tape clicked off, I didn't cry. I just whispered, I heard you. And that was enough. Because echoes aren't just sounds bouncing back. They're truths we finally stop running from. Weeks passed. I wrote a letter to my mother. No return address. Just a single sentence inside. I understand now. That doesn't mean I'm okay. But it means I see you. I started volunteering. One afternoon a week. Just listening to people tell stories no one else had the patience to sit through. I stopped trying to perform grief like a character and started living with it like a second spine. I told the truth when it hurt. I said I'm sorry when I meant it. I walked away from what didn't grow me, even if it made me lonely. And sometimes, late at night, when everything goes still, I hear her voice again, not from a tape, not from a letter, just in the air. Take care of your soul. She never meant it as a warning. She meant it as a hand on the back, gently pushing me forward. You don't walk away from a story like this. Not really. You carry it in your breath, in your decisions, in the way your hand hovers over send before a hard message, in the way you pause before telling a small lie, in the way silence now feels heavier than shouting. What she left me wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't shame either. It was a mirror, and you either face it or you break it and repeat the cycle. I started doing small things differently. I didn't wait until holidays to call people. I showed up when it was inconvenient. I let people see me raw, not in curated posts, in late-night phone calls, in awkward silences, in tears that didn't make sense but needed somewhere to land. I wrote letters to people who would never read them. To my mom, to myself at 15, to grandma again and again. And every time I signed them, I didn't write love. I wrote still here, because presence is all some people never got, and I was learning how to give it even late. One rainy afternoon, I sat on the floor of my apartment, locket in hand, and opened it one more time. The photo inside was fading, just a blur of lines now, but I saw her, I felt her. Not in my chest, in my choices, I whispered, you win. And I meant it, not in defeat, in surrender. To the better version of me she never got to meet, but somehow believed could exist. That week, I found an old voicemail from her, dated over a year before she died. I'd never opened it, probably ignored it when it came in. Her voice tinny through the speaker, just calling to say I made apple bread. I know it's your favorite. No pressure, but if you're in the area, come by. If not, that's okay too. I love you, always. That message split me open in a way no letter ever could, because it was casual, gentle, unassuming, and that's the kind of love I always failed to recognize, the kind that just waits, and it hit me. The real revenge wasn't in the will. It wasn't in the journal. It wasn't in the public omission or the private letters. The real revenge was in how much she still loved me after everything. That love haunted me more than punishment ever could. I kept the voicemail, saved it to 3 backup drives, because grief doesn't care about technology. When it comes, you reach for what's left. I started talking about her. Not just the soft stuff, not just the soup and sweaters, but the sharpness, the stubborn strength, the way she could cut with one sentence, the way she used silence not to hurt, but to make you sit in your own mess long enough to see it. I stopped trying to be lovable and started trying to be accountable. Some days I still flinch when people ask about her. I still lie sometimes, still feel the urge to vanish. But then I hear it again, her voice, not loud, not even real anymore. Just there like breath in the room. Take care of your soul, I say it back now. Every time I leave a place, every time I hang up, every time I feel myself slipping, because this isn't just her story anymore. It's mine, it's yours. It belongs to anyone who's ever broken something they thought was unbreakable and still had to look in the mirror the next day. It belongs to those who came back and those who didn't, but mostly it belongs to those who stayed. Some stories don't end, they just echo. Through the choices we make, through the silences we keep, through the names we whisper when no one else is around. What she left behind wasn't just a will or a letter or a scar. It was a question. What are you going to do with what you carry? If you felt something in this story, don't brush it off. Let it sit. Let it ask. Let it push back at whatever part of you has been too quiet too long. Because maybe you've sold something you swore you protect. Maybe you've kept a silence that grew teeth in your sleep. Maybe you've waited too long to say the thing that still burns your chest. Or maybe, just maybe, you're the one who stayed. And if that's true, then you know the weight. You know what it means to be the one who cleans up, who forgives quietly, who holds a family together with nothing but willpower and soft words that no one ever thanks you for. This story was never just about a locket. It was about legacy, about the cost of carrying what others buried, about what happens when someone finally refuses to stay silent. And now it's yours. So maybe tonight you light a candle, or pick up the phone, or open that old drawer you haven't dared touch in years. Maybe you write a letter that won't be sent. Maybe you forgive someone who never earned it. Maybe you forgive yourself. Because Grandma wasn't trying to haunt us. She was trying to hand us something, not punishment, but pattern breaking. If this story meant something to you, share it, not for clicks, not for numbers, but because somebody out there might need it the way I didn't know I did. Thank you for watching Grandma's Real Stories. We've got more letters, more secrets, more weight, and if you're ready to hear them, we'll be here, still.